Welcome to our webinar about project-based learning, or PBL. I'm John Larmer, Director of Product Development at the Buck Institute for Education. We're a nonprofit that provides PBL materials, research, and support to organizations and professional development. One of the first questions people at our workshops need to know is, what is PBL? So that's the question this webinar will answer. Basically, project-based learning is a teaching method in which students engage in sort of a collaborative, in-depth, extended study of an authentic topic, and it ends with a product or a presentation of their work. But that's kind of an academic definition. We usually like to define PBL by describing examples and explaining the essential elements every good project should have. So here's a video we created with our friends at Common Craft that explains PBL. We'll use this as an example to explain the 8 essential elements of PBL. If you've already seen this 4-minute video, you can skip to the end to our discussion of it.
You remember what it was like in school. It was boring. You sat in class, memorized as much as you could, and tried to pass a test at the end. But is that good enough? These days, school can be more interesting and effective by focusing students on work that matters. This is project-based learning explained. Most adults live in a world of projects. Whether it's a job assignment, home improvement, or planning a wedding, we need to actively solve problems. But unfortunately, schoolwork looks more like this than this. Let's take a look at this project-based world. Meet Claire. She was recently presented with a challenge. Her company, Super Suds, makes soap, and it was up to her to find the most earth-friendly way to produce it in the future. Her boss gave her a budget and a few requirements, and it was up to her to come up with a solution. She organized and managed a team who researched the options and created materials summarizing the issues. Claire's team asked for feedback and presented their findings to the boss. Claire came out of the project looking like a rock star, and she learned a lot about green products. If you look closely, Claire's success involved critical thinking, collaboration, and communication, things that aren't often taught in traditional classrooms. The world needs more Claires, so how do we get them? The answer is project-based learning, or PBL. By focusing students on a project, teachers put them on a path that deepens their knowledge and builds skills they'll need in the future. Here's what I mean. Mr. Simmons has always been a good science teacher, and his students do well on Friday's tests. Unfortunately, what they learned was gone by Saturday morning. That wasn't good enough for him. Soon he learned about project-based learning and decided to give it a shot. Mr. Simmons got the idea for his first project on microorganisms when nearly half of his students were suddenly absent with the flu. He asked his students why they thought so many of their classmates got sick at the same time. That lively discussion produced a lot of good questions and a list of things the kids wanted to know. Mr. Simmons then announced their project was to help elementary school kids understand, how can we not get sick? After dividing the class into teams, he got them started on the project. It was up to the students to ask questions, research, collaborate, give each other feedback, and figure out the best ways to make their points clear to children. One team chose to make an educational video on the connection between hand washing and avoiding the flu. Another chose to create posters to show how viruses spread. The project teams showed off their final work to an enthusiastic audience of parents and their children at a nearby elementary school. Sitting in the front row was our good friend and local rock star Claire, who saw a bit of herself in the students. It was clear that the project was a success for the students, the audience, and Mr. Simmons. His students practiced critical thinking, collaboration, and communication. The project wasn't about memorization, but learning in depth about viruses and how to prevent spreading disease, a lesson they will never forget. At the end of the presentation, Claire introduced herself to the students and told them that they were rock stars and that the world needs more people who can think like them. To learn more about project-based learning, go to BIE.org.
Okay, so this video helps us explain the essential elements of project-based learning. PBL is sometimes confused with simply having students do a hands-on activity or make something like a poster or a model. But we think to really be PBL, a project has to have 8 essential elements, which you can see on this diagram. In the center are your learning goals for students, so we'll start there. First is significant content. A project should be focused on teaching students important knowledge and skills based on your standards and key concepts in a subject area. It should be significant to the teacher and to the students, as well as, of course, in what terms of what districts and states and important tests measure. In the past, some people thought that PBL was guilty of being content light. They thought that sort of non-content outcomes like student engagement and soft skills were overemphasized. But we think you need both content and skills, and that's why the railroad track is zipped together here. They're parallel tracks, content and skills, that get students where you want them to go. Remember in the project in the video, Mr. Simmons thought about his standards and knew that microorganisms and diseases were an important part of those standards. They'd probably be on the state test, and it was significant to him and his students. 21st century skills are very easily taught in project-based learning. In fact, one of the best ways to teach those skills. 3 of the ones that you see a lot are critical thinking or problem solving, collaboration skills, and communication, especially presentation skills. And these are skills that young people need to be more successful in the future, in school, in their life, and in the workplace. And we think PBL, as I said, is one of the best ways to teach those skills, but you need to really teach them because students can get better at them if they see them modeled and talk about them and practice them. These skills also need to be assessed so students can get more feedback on how well they're doing. And these kind of skills will become even more important in schools if they're explicitly assessed and reported and factored into grades, information given to students, parents, even employers and colleges and so forth. In the video, remember students engaged in critical thinking and problem solving and some creativity where they weren't just following a recipe for how to solve the problem or answer the driving question. They had to think of their own products and their own presentations and analyze and synthesize information, troubleshoot problems that came up, and so forth. They also had to work in teams. They were collaborating when they did their research and created products and planned their presentations. And they practiced presentation skills when they used the internet to find information and created visual media and made their oral presentations. In-depth inquiry is required of students in a project, and by that we don't just mean looking stuff up on the internet, not just research. It's a way of thinking inquiry that involves asking questions, finding answers to help support your conclusions, finding resources, thinking of new questions as you get deeper in. People often think of inquiry in science experiments or investigations or research papers, maybe in history, but any project can have inquiry. For example, even creating a mural would require inquiry about what's the best location, what material should we use, what's the most appropriate image, or designing a website, who's the client, what do they want, what does a visitor to the site want to see, how can we make it work well for those visitors. There's also an element of innovation in inquiry where students are finding their own answers to questions, their own unique products. They aren't just repackaging information or building something from a kit or following directions. In the video, we saw the students asking in-depth questions about why their classmates were getting sick, how are diseases transmitted, what germs are, and how they affect the human body, and so on. And Mr. Simmons provided some of the answers, but also the students had to dig for some of their own, and they thought of new, deeper questions along the way. A driving question organizes the whole project. It sort of captures the issue or the problem or the challenge for students to address. It sort of frames the project as answering a question, which reinforces that idea of a project being about inquiry. A driving question has 3 main characteristics. It should be open-ended. There's more than one possible answer. It's understandable to students. It engages them. It doesn't sound like a textbook or a teacher. It sort of inspires them and focuses them. And thirdly, it's linked to what you want students to learn. To answer it, they've got to learn the content and the skills that you want them to learn. In the video, the project, the question was, how can we not get sick? And this driving question focused all the work the students did during the project. Some driving questions can be more philosophical or abstract. For example, the one for this project could have been something like, how can little things have big effects? Or you could have a more specific and very task-focused driving question. For example, this one could have been, how can we create a presentation to tell elementary school students how not to get sick? I need to know. This is a real fundamental, important concept in project-based learning. It's very important differentiation from other teaching methods. The project creates the need to know the content in the students. Traditionally in school, students learn stuff because they have to. It's going to be on the test. They want to please the teacher or their parents or the grade, or they might say it's more important for you later in life in school. But that may motivate only a few students. But if they're really exploring an interesting question or meeting a challenge, students are more motivated to learn. They have that need to know. Also, if they got to present to an audience, that creates a need to know. The need to know starts with an entry event, which sort of engages students and gets them going and sparks their curiosity, leads them to ask questions, like Mr. Simmons had a discussion with the students about why so many students were absent. And they also had a need to know the content and skills students learned because they were going to be presenting their products to the elementary school audience. Voice and choice means that students are given some degree of ownership of the process in a project. They feel more engaged, they feel like more independent thinkers if they're given a chance to express some voice and make choices during the project. If students are new to a project, new to PBL, students may not get as much voice and choice as if they're more experienced with PBL. But later on, teachers can give students choices over things like even the driving question itself, or what sub-questions they might inquire about, what products they might create, or who will be on their team, or what resources they'll use, how to organize their time and task. In the video, the students made choices about what kind of media they would produce, how to communicate their message to the audience, and how to make their presentations. Revision and reflection means that during a project there should be some frequent and regular opportunities for students to get feedback from peers and from the teacher, or perhaps other adults if they're involved, so they can revise their work and make it better. For example, they might review their research notes or rough drafts, prototypes, critique as happens, and they might practice their presentations to make them better. And this leads to high quality products, and the culture of critique and revision should be a part of every PBL classroom. In Mr. Simmons' classroom, you saw that the students were giving each other feedback on their work in progress as they went through and created their presentations and media products. A public audience is important in project-based learning because it's one of the ways, as I said before, to motivate students. And there are other good reasons for having a public audience. They need to think critically about their audience, so it encourages that critical thinking skill. What's best for this particular audience? Who are we speaking to? What questions might we be asked, and so forth. It gives the students a chance to show that they've built their skills and they are exhibiting their work as proof to their community. It's a way for a school to be accountable beyond just its test scores. And it sort of finishes the project with a bang. As we saw on this project, Mr. Simmons' students presented to the elementary school audience with the parents and students in the audience, and Claire from the video. And it's sort of a way to celebrate and show the world what your students can do too, and it impresses people and helps them celebrate a job well done. So when you're designing a project, think about those 8 elements and ask yourself, does my project include important content and skills? Does it have chances for students to really build those 21st century skills? Are they going to go in depth, or is it just going to be superficial? Are they focused on a driving question that engages them? Do they really need to know important content and skills to answer the question? Do they have some opportunities to make some decisions for themselves? Do they have chances for that critique and revision process and reflect at the end of a project? And is there a public audience for my students' work? To learn more about what PBL is, you can read 2 articles we published and posted on our website. And also at BIE.org, you can find project design tutorials, project planning and management tools, how-to books, sample projects, and information about our professional development and research. So, want PBL? Think BIE.